Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Heart of Darkness, written by Joseph Conrad. Now, Heart of Darkness is a very different novel. It's not your traditional novel where you get a character and see how that character develops throughout the course of the novel. The Heart of Darkness to me is really a novel that looks at how Europeans treated Africans or treated people of color throughout the age of imperialism, and you can even say, in some ways, colonization. Because a lot of times, when a piece of land that has people on it, whenever a land that has people on it is being conquered or being taken over, the party that does the conquering, they usually view those people as savages. They usually view those people as individuals that are not um, at. That's basically they're not at their level. That's usually how Europeans viewed indigenous people. And so the Heart of Darkness is important. To me, the way I saw it is that um, the Africans, they were depicted to be savages, and this novel has received a lot of criticism because it dehumanizes Africans, it dehumanizes colored people, and that's not a false notion. I can't say that's a false notion because the Europeans did view people of Africa. They did view the people of Africa as savages because again, yes, they weren't at their level at that point because the Europeans, they were coming from societies, they were coming from structured built societies, and they were going into a jungle that just had people in it. So to them, the people that existed in that jungle, they weren't people to them. To me, there are some contradictions because my definition of a civilization is where a body of people collectively decide to live together in a structured government per se. And in the jungle, you see a lot of African Americans, a lot of collective groups of African Americans. They built their own tribes. So they had their own way of living. They had their own way of existing. And even though even though they weren't at the same level as the Europeans with their civilizations, they still had their own structured way of living. And fundamentally, that's what a society is. But just because the Europeans didn't understand them, just because the Europeans didn't understand their culture, they just classified them as savages. Now, another thing that can point to that the Africans did have their own culture, they did have their own society, is how there's this one African in the novel, and she had all these accolades. She had all these ornaments on her body to show that she is a person of value to her community. And that shows that there is structure, there is respect, there is a way in which things are done within these tribes. And again, that reflects society. So to me, the Europeans really they it was based off of ignorance. The fact that they didn't know how African culture worked in Africa, they just said they were savages. And so another thing I think that does reflect that too. The Kurtz is a very important character within Heart of Darkness. He's a man who goes into the jungle. Again, in this novel, Africa is a place that is not explored. So this man by the name of Kurtz, he goes into Africa, and he says, "Oh, I'm going there to get ivory, but while I'm there, I'm going to deliver this knowledge. I'm going to deliver this wisdom to these people because I'm better than them, and I need to share my wisdom." And so he does go into Africa. He, of course, he's going to get the ivory, but surprisingly, he doesn't change the people change him. So even though that the Europeans thought of the Africans as savages, they managed to assimilate Kurtz into their society. One of the tribes basically got him to adopt their culture, and he becomes a prominent member of their culture. They kind of look to him as a king or a leader, and so and Kurtz decides to stay in the jungle. Eventually, he does die, but for the longest while, it seems as if Kurtz was assimilated into a tribe, into African culture. So he wasn't held there against his will. He just decided himself to stay, and he learned how to communicate with the African people. He didn't have a translator, so he learned how to communicate, and he learned how to live amongst them. So this man went into Africa thinking that he was going to change the people of Africa, but the thing is, everything switches around on him, and he is the one that gets changed. And really, I think his first notion to go in and give them wisdom, or to make them civilized, it's very ludicrous, because the Africans, in certain ways, they were already civilized because they had their structured body of how they did things. They had people in higher places in higher places than others. So that suggests they had their own civilization. They had their own way of living, although it's not, reflective of Europe. They still had their own structured society. So just because the Europeans didn't understand their culture, just because the Europeans didn't understand how they functioned, they automatically said that they were savages. So, and I can't say that this novel, it's not wrong, because when we go to the age of European imperialism, you do get that idea that Europeans believed that their culture, their ideas, their civilization was better than others. And so they came up with this idea that we have to educate, we have to teach them our ways. We see this in the Western world, in the colonization of the Western world, and in many other places where this imperial force comes in, and they basically impose their ideas on indigenous people or people who are at a lesser power than them. So the most important characters within Heart of Darkness is this man by the name of Marlowe, and of course Kurtz. And Marlowe is another tradesman. He goes into Africa. He's had this desire since he was a kid to explore Africa, and he goes down the Congo River. It's very dehumanizing. A lot of the Africans that are depicted, some of them are cannibals. There are some scenes where they show that the Africans went to eat a helmsman that died, and it's very dehumanizing. It shows that the Europeans are light years ahead, and that they know what's right, while the Africans are not even human, basically. So this novel did get a lot of criticism for, I guess, its racist ideas, but in certain ways it's not completely wrong, because if we look at history, that's how Europeans viewed Africans, and so um, um, we get this gradual build where Marlowe is going down the Congo River, and he's seeing horrific things. He's seeing things that leave a scar on the mind. And some of these things, they kind of mess up with his thinking, because you're seeing people basically getting mixed in with death. Some of the Africans, they're depicted to be one with the rotting part of the jungle. And that kind of brings me back to the title of this this novel, The Heart of Darkness. In many ways, the jungle itself uh, resembles a heart because you get this beating. The deeper they go down the Congo River, the deeper they go down to the forest, you get this beating, like just like a heartbeat, and it's just it's kind of it's not it's getting louder as they go down. In some ways, because you're seeing more horrific things as you go down. The things keep coming and they're worse, and people are dying, and you're seeing savagery and you're seeing that the view that Europeans have with Africans in Africa, that they were nothing but savages, and that was their view. And as they go down the river, you're getting this build that it's getting worse, and this thumping is just getting louder. And so eventually, close to the end of the novel, we do see this reunion between Marlowe and Kurtz. Marlowe is extremely he's changed because he knows how bad it is in Africa and how the Europeans are treating the Africans. They have already begun turning a lot of the Africans into slaves because there are these posts within the jungle where the Europeans setting up shop and importing and exporting ivory. Um, they're just getting ivory and shipping it out. And there's basically a lot of oppression, and they're dehumanizing a lot of Africans. And so Kurtz and Marlowe, they do meet at the end. Marlowe is like he urges Kurtz to go back to civilization, but Kurt is fully assimilated into this African lifestyle. He, in many ways, I think he resists, and he doesn't even make it out like back. He doesn't even make it back to European society because he dies, and the last thing he says is the horror, the horror. And so I think Kurtz changes because he goes into Africa. He goes in thinking that he was the superior mind and that he was going to change their thinking and make them civilized. But really, he just understood the horrors of the jungle. He understood the horrors that the Africans were facing with European oppression. And so, in many ways, the first views that he came with, the first views that he started the novel with, I don't think he dies with those same views because by living with these Africans and by being assimilated with these Africans, I think he truly understood that they did have a culture, that they did have a way of understanding each other, a collective way of working with each other. Because these Africans, they made specific groups for each other, and they supported each other. They had their tribes, and tribes are basically an early version of society, a early version of civilization. Because if you take away the skyscrapers, the structures, the factories, and you just leave the people, um, society is really just a body of people working together to benefit themselves. Because in a society, everybody benefits because everybody does something in some ways benefit the collective whole. You know, and really that's why society works. And in tribes, you get that same idea. Some people do some things. You probably have hunters and people who do other things. What I'm basically saying, everybody does something within a tribe, and so they have that. So if we're going to talk about culture, if we're going to talk civilization, we can't just say the Africans that appear within Heart of Darkness are savages because they did have their own society, their own way, their own structured way of living their lives. And so Kurtz, he dies with the words the horror," and really most people have interpreted that to mean basically the horrors of the jungle and the horrors of how these Africans are being oppressed and how they're being dehumanized when they are humans. And that's the whole thing with the criticism. Uh, a lot of people were mad at the novel for dehumanizing the Africans when they did have their own ways of life. And so Marlowe does leave the jungle in a very um, in an ominous way. I think he has a scar, a mental scar of the things you've seen, of the horrors you've seen, of the oppression, the dehumanization of certain people. And so, to me, the Heart of Darkness, it really talks about how Europeans and how the old world viewed the people of Africa. And later, we can say that this even applies to the Western world and its colonization, because all of the people in the Western world, when the Europeans, when they got here, they view them as savages. And the whole idea with we need to civilize them, we need to make them humans when they were already humans. Because all of the tribes, all of the people that were in the Western world, all of the people that show up in Heart of Darkness, all of the Africans, all of the indigenous people, they had their culture, they had their own civilization. And so I think another important thing to take from this novel is how ignorance plays a role. You know, just because the Europeans didn't understand the culture of these Africans, they said that they were savages. And so really, I think the Heart of Darkness has truth to it in that circumstance. It has a lot of truth to it and how the Africans were treated. It has a lot of truth to it and how the Europeans were basically going into Africa for the money, for the ivory, for basically their own wealth. And you know, we get that in history. You know, later we get slavery. So I think Heart of Darkness. I know I jumped with history and Heart of Darkness because I think it's really realistic in how history played out. I think that the Heart of Darkness really tackles some ideas that have been talked about the detriments that took place within history, within African American history, within African history in general. And so that's why I think The Heart of Darkness is a very different novel. It's not really about the characters. I think, to me, and through my interpretation, I think it says a lot about history and a lot about European imperialism and how the Africans were oppressed and how they were dehumanized when they had their own civilization, when they had their own culture. So I hope you guys like that review, summary, whatever you want to name it. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.